Hello and welcome to Sam-Splaining Science. I am Sam. I'm your host. I'll be Sam-Splaining the science. And today we are back for another episode highlighting Black scientists throughout history in honor of Black History Month. But before we get into the scientists and their contributions to the field, as always, quick little check-in. How are ya? I hope things are going well for you. I hope that you're staying warm wherever you are. We in New York have had a little taste of spring weather, followed by what is now predicted to be one of the largest snowstorms of this decade. So, not quite in the clear yet. Weeping. I'm just tired of snow, man. I really am. And it had just started melting because it had been freezing since the last snowstorm. So the snow has just been here piled up. And it was finally melting. The sidewalks were finally clear and it was all good. And now they're 20 inches of snow. Awesome. Yes. Okay. It's fine. It's going to be fine. We're almost there because we're almost at the end of February, which means that we're almost in March, which is my least favorite month, by the way. I hate March. I'm a March hater. It's too long and time moves too slowly in March. But then after that, it's spring. So we're almost there. We're getting there. Almost. But anyway, besides the weather, things have been fine. Nothing too crazy going on. Nothing to brag about or complain about or talk about, really. So I guess that's good. Could be worse. Could be better. But could also be worse. But I hope you're good. I hope you have things to brag about. And I hope you don't have many things to complain about. And yeah. Thank you for tuning in and for listening. And without further ado, let's get into the questions for today, which of course are related to our topic for the episode of Black scientists in history. So just like part one of Black History Month's Sam-Splaining Science episodes, today we're going to highlight two separate scientists, although it's technically three scientists. So the first half of the episode, we're going to be talking about Mamie, Phipps Clark, and Kenneth Clark, who were a duo, we'll get into who they were in the first question. But then as we did in the last episode, we're going to have a little sub question that kind of digs into a little bit of the research that they did. So with Mamie Phipps Clark and Kenneth Clark, we'll be talking about their doll study. And then for the second half of the episode, we're going to talk about Percy Julian, who is a chemist. And we're going to talk about some of his contributions to the fields of organic chemistry, specifically his contributions to making synthetic steroids and what they're used for in the clinic today. So as always, my sources will be linked in the episode description, so feel free to check them out to learn more and read more and fact check me. I always encourage that. But yeah, let's get into question number one, which is who were Mamie Phipps Clark and Kenneth Clark? So as I mentioned before, Mamie Phipps Clark and Kenneth Clark were a duo. They were husband and wife, a power couple. We love to see it. And they were both psychologists and advocates. They were both born in the 1910s, and Mamie was born in Arkansas, and Kenneth was born in Harlem, New York. They met at university. They both went to Howard University in Washington, D.C. for their bachelor's and master's degrees. And at Howard University, Mamie wrote a master's thesis, which is titled, quote, "The Development of Consciousness in," oh my gosh, maybe I can read. "The Development of Consciousness of Self in Negro Preschool Children," end quote. And this study led the way for their future research, which we'll get into in a second. But after graduating from Howard University, they both moved to New York City, where they went to Columbia University for their PhDs. And they both studied psychology for their PhD. And Mamie and Kenneth, or should I say Dr. Phipps Clark and Dr. Clark, were the first two African Americans to obtain their PhDs in psychology from Columbia University in New York City. So that's quite an accomplishment. And together in New York, they both worked on research on the self-identification in Black children, which later developed into their doll study, which leads us to our first sub-question, which is, what is the doll study, or what was the doll study? The doll study was a psychological research experiment that tested the effects of segregation on Black children's impression of themselves and of others. So in this study, children between the ages of 3 and 7, so like young childhood, early school age children, and some of these kids attended integrated schools in the North where kids were, attending school regardless of what race they were. And then some of the kids were attending segregated schools, which were segregated, classified by race. And these children were asked a series of questions about plastic dolls that they were given. And the dolls were identical. They were the same size, the same shape, wearing the same clothes, the same diapers, but they differed in skin color. And the researchers, Dr. Clark and Dr. Phipps Clark, asked the kids a series of questions about these dolls. Some of them were like obvious questions, like which one is the white doll? Which one is the black doll? So the kid knew the difference between the race dolls. Then they got into questions like, which doll do you want to play with? Or which doll looks nice? Which doll looks like a bad doll? Which doll is a nice color? Quotes. Which doll looks like you? Right? And they asked a series of questions to these kids about the black doll and the white doll. And what they found was that in this cohort of kids, it was almost 240 children that were kind of surveyed like this. A majority of the kids, maybe I should say also that this study took place in the late 1930s, like late 1930s, early 1940s era, to put some historical context into what this means. This means that, segregation was a very much normal thing in American society. And there was, we'll get into that more in a second, actually. But I just want to state that that was like a very legal thing that was happening in American history at this point in time. And what they found from the study was that most of the kids, most of these 240 children, they stratified them by kids who attended integrated schools in the North and kids who attended segregated schools in the South. Regardless of which type of school the kids went to, a majority of the children preferred to play with the white doll. So most of the kids, when they asked them, which doll do you want to play with? Most of them chose the white doll over the black doll. Additionally, most of the kids, when asked which doll is the nice doll, most of the children chose the white doll as the nice doll. And the conclusion from this study was that, I'm going to read a couple direct quotes here. So the conclusion from the study was that, quote, prejudice, discrimination, and segregation caused Black children to develop a sense of inferiority and self-hatred. The Clarks concluded, quote, if society says it is better to be white, not only white people, but Black people will come to believe it. So this psychological study really showed the impact that society has on sort of imposing racial biases even as young as 3 to 7 years old, which I think is still present today, although not maybe to the same degree as in the 1930s and 1940s. But we in 2026, as an American society, still very much have racial biases and racial undertones in our media, in our news, in the books we read. And there has been progress of making these things more diverse, but it still is very much biased. And this study really just showed the impact of the biases that we have in society on children and the way that they view themselves and others. One thing that I found super interesting about this study, and it's an idea that I'm very passionate about, is that the results of this study were cited in the Supreme Court decision for Brown versus Board of Education. So a little American history lesson, not too long because you know I'm not a history girly, but Brown versus Board of Education was the Supreme Court case that ended in the decision that segregating public schools is illegal. Before Brown versus Board of Education, there was a Supreme Court decision called Plessy versus Ferguson, which implied that, or ruled that, as long as facilities are, quote, separate but equal, that is legal. So you can have segregated schools where this school is for white children, this school is for black children, as long as they're, quote unquote, equal. But we all know the reality of that is not likely to be equal, and certainly wasn't back in the 1930s. So Brown versus Board of Education was the Supreme Court case that said this is separate but equal is not it. Like, you can, like, segregation in public schools is illegal. It is not allowed. And the Dahl study that was conducted by Dr. Phipps Clark and Dr. Clark was cited in that Supreme Court decision as saying that the impact of racial segregation on children, especially children of school age, is present in the way that they view themselves and others. So it's very important to not segregate or, separate based on the class of race. I have a couple more quotes here that I'm going to read. Sorry, I don't love doing direct quotes, but I think that they're important here. So yeah, it says here in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, which is about, 10, 15 years after the Dahl study was performed, the Supreme Court used the Clark's research and acknowledged, quote, to separate African American children from others of similar age and qualifications solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely ever to be undone. Which is just sad and heartbreaking to think about. But as we know, with the results of the Phipps, Clark, and Clark study, the Dahl study, this is true. Kids notice the difference, and kids make implications, or I guess inferences about good versus bad based on, in this case, race, skin color, and that then kind of imprints in their brain about what is good, what is bad, what should I play with, what should I want to play with, what do I not want to play with. And if there isn't a conscious effort to counteract that, that could really leave a lasting impression on the way that they view themselves, their self-consciousness, and the way that they view others as well. I have another quote here from Dr. Kenneth Clark, who was interviewed for a documentary on the civil rights movement by PBS. So Dr. Kenneth Clark says, quote, We did the study 14 years before Brown versus Board of Education, and the lawyers from the NAACP learned about it and came and asked us if we thought it was relevant to what they were planning to do in terms of the Brown decision cases. And we told them it was up to them to make that decision, and we did not do it for litigation. We did it to communicate to our colleagues in psychology the influence of race and color and status on the self-esteem of children. I really love this quote. I think as a scientist, it's important to know, like, you're doing research not to make a political point, right? Like especially like this sort of like observational psychological research. You shouldn't approach it with a bias of this is going to be the case, right? These kids are going to have these racial biases, because that's a biased way of thinking where you could be more likely to skew the data or skew the results. And what Dr. Clark is saying is that we didn't do this to make a point, right? We did this to explore and inform our colleagues of how these, how segregation, how racial bias impacts children, their brains and development, the way that they see themselves and other people. So I really liked that quote. I wrote it down because I liked it. And then I think it also kind of calls to the fact that although that's not the motivation for the study to like make a political statement, I want to highlight, and this is what's important to me, is that the results of this study informs our policy, right? We used who's we? Not me. They used the results of this study to support legislation. And I guess it technically was a Supreme Court decision, so it was a judicial decision. But in turn, legislation for the way that American civilians will live our lives, right? I think that is how it should be done. Science shouldn't be kind of crafted around laws or shouldn't be motivated by laws, but the other way around. Laws should be crafted as a result of what we find in science. So I just thought that was a very important point to make with Dr. Phipps Clark and Dr. Clark, their findings from the doll study and how it has impacted the way that we live our lives, both understanding the psychology of it and then also on like a more political, legislative level. So I hope you enjoyed learning that. I enjoyed reading it. And I think it's really important to highlight and to call out. So thank you to Dr. Phipps Clark and Dr. Clark for your contributions to the field of psychology, and in turn, the impacts that those contributions have had on the way that we live our lives in American society. And now we will move on to the second part of our episode, which is about Dr. Percy Julian. I am going to admit that I am double dipping a little bit. So when I first started my podcast in 2022, I did have a Black History Month episode where I talked about 4 historical Black figures in science. And I did talk about Percy Julian. I have talked a little bit about him on this podcast already, but I don't think I did the best job of it. And I don't think I did a good job diving into the science behind his contributions. So I'm going to try to give it another go. Any diehard Sam-splaining science listeners may have recognized this already. So my apologies if I repeated myself. But if you're a new listener, welcome, and let's learn about Dr. Percy Julian. Dr. Percy Julian was an organic chemist and an educator. Fun fact about me, I hated organic chemistry. It was literally the bane of my existence in college. But not Percy's. He loved it. Percy, like we're on a first name basis. That's so disrespectful. Dr. Julian, he was an organic chemist. He studied undergrad at DePaul University. He got a master's degree from Harvard and got his PhD in Vienna in Austria. And I'm pretty sure, I should have double checked this before I started saying this sentence, but I'm going to say it again. I'm pretty sure that his PhD took like 2 years or something crazy like that, which if you have a PhD, you know you have to be freaking brilliant to finish that in 2 years. And he did. So a brilliant mind. After his PhD, he taught chemistry at Howard University. So a little crossover from Mamie Phipps Clark and Kenneth Clark, who met at Howard University. And he also taught chemistry at DePaul University, which is where he went for his undergrad degree. After spending some time in academia, being a professor, doing some research, he, like many brilliant scientists in this world, present company included, made the jump from academia to industry. And he worked as the chief chemist and director of soya production division at Glidden Company, which was a company that, as you can imagine from his title, aimed to create or synthesize chemicals from soy. Some of these chemicals that were synthesized were things like paint from soybeans. But I think some of Dr. Julian's most impactful contributions from the Glidden Company were actually the development of steroid hormones synthetically from soybeans. So we're going to get into that a little bit on the next slide, but I want to talk a little bit more about Dr. Julian as a person before we get into his science. So while noting all of these incredible accomplishments throughout his education, his academic career, his industry career, these accomplishments didn't happen in a vacuum. They didn't happen in isolation. Dr. Julian was still existing as a Black man in 1940s Chicago, where at the time discrimination, as we know, segregation, and racial biases were a major problem. And he and his family were targeted. There were multiple targeted attacks against him and his family. In one incident, there were like explosives thrown at their home. In another incident, they were victims of an arson attack. So I think it's important to call out here that although he was a brilliant chemist and he had developed things that we'll get into in a minute, but like literally changed lives, he was still a victim of racial violence and discrimination. So I, do want to acknowledge that and call that out, because it's important that we don't ignore that part of his experience. But even with this, he really did have an incredibly impressive career. He'd published over 160 publications during his scientific career, which is an amazing feat. He earned 15 honorary degrees, and he was awarded the Spingarn Medal from the NAACP. So he is quite established and decorated, and he has a lot of these accomplishments, which is really impressive, especially considering the crap that he had to put up with of, just existing as a Black man in 1940 Chicago. So a real brilliant mind existing in a world that didn't make it easy for him to have a brilliant mind. Okay, so that is my spiel on the biography of Dr. Percy Julian, but let's talk about his contributions. So I mentioned that while he was at the Glidden Company, I also skipped over this part of the bullet where after working at the Glidden Company, he left and founded his own company called Julian Laboratories, where he continued some of this work. But at the Glidden Company, he worked on a project that developed a mechanism or a method to synthesize chemicals from soybeans. And specifically, the chemicals that he synthesized that were really groundbreaking, or life-changing, but not both, Sam. Choose one. The chemicals that the mechanisms that he developed to make these chemicals that were the most groundbreaking for science at the time were the synthesizing of synthetic steroids, which in turn can be used to make hormones. So now we're going to get into the second part of this question, which is what are synthetic steroids used for? So I figured it would be good to kind of start out with like a base layer of understanding of what is a steroid. I think we've all heard of steroids. We've all seen like the big bulky men at the gym who like, maybe lose their temper because someone knocked their water bottle over, and you think, okay, steroids, right? We've been there, we've seen it. But what a steroid actually is it's a chemical structure, a chemical compound. There are different types of steroids, but they all kind of have this very similar structure, which I've shown on the PowerPoint slide on the YouTube video, if you want to take a look. But they basically all have this sort of characteristic 4 carbon rings. And again, I'm not a chemist, and I hated organic chemistry, so don't ask me anything more than the fact that it has 4 carbon-based rings. But steroids, like steroid molecules, all kind of have the similar structure, but differ slightly depending on the function. There are steroids that kind of exist naturally in the human body, and many of these steroids that exist naturally in the human body are hormones. And another important thing to note is that in many cases, depending on the field, hormones and steroids can be useful in therapy. So I'm going to get into 2 examples of synthetic hormones that Dr. Julian developed methodologies in order to create. So basically, instead of having these hormones and steroids naturally in the body, Dr. Julian created a way to make these steroids, hormones, outside the body, create them at a mass scale for cheap, so that they can then in turn be used for certain therapeutic applications. So the first example that we're going to talk about is synthetic cortisone, which thanks to Dr. Julian can be made at a lower cost in bulk than a real cortisone would be. So that can make it, at the time, this made cortisone accessible to people who weren't super wealthy, because other methods to create cortisone were more, I guess, what's the word I'm thinking of? They were more, not extravagant, but I guess in a way, they were just more complicated. And it was more difficult to get isolated cortisone before Dr. Julian developed a way to get cortisone from soybean plants. Okay, so cortisone is a chemical that resembles cortisol, which cortisol exists naturally in our bodies. We need cortisol. I feel like cortisol is kind of like a buzzword in the like health sphere right now, and people are saying like, your cortisol levels are high, like Dr. TikTok, whatever the hell they say over there. But we need cortisol. It is our stress hormone. It is released by adrenal glands, which kind of sit on top of our kidneys. And there are many useful aspects of cortisol in our body. It can be used for a lot of things, including having a transient or time-sensitive anti-inflammatory response. So cortisol can potentially reduce the function of the immune system, and the immune system's role is to create inflammation. One example of this is in rheumatoid arthritis, which is where there's inflammation in your joints. Most often it's like your wrists, your elbows, your ankles, your knees, kind of like joints on the extremities. And there's like inflammation in these joints. Cortisone acts like cortisol because structurally they look very similar. So following the example of rheumatoid arthritis, in this case, cortisol or cortisone, which looks and acts like cortisol, can be introduced into joints that are experiencing inflammation in order to have this like temporary anti-inflammatory effect. So you might have heard someone having to go and get a cortisone shot in their ankle, in their knee, in their elbow. If they, especially if they have rheumatoid arthritis or a lot of inflammation in those joints, the cortisone can be injected into those joints and act like cortisol to allow for a anti-inflammatory effect. And this cortisone that's injected into these joints is synthetic. It's not, naturally made in the human body. It's synthesized in a lab. And Dr. Percy Julian, who developed methodologies to develop cortisone from soy plants, really set the stage to allow us to create synthetic cortisone at levels that are conducive to supplying cortisone for therapy in bulk, right? Like across the country, across the world, really, people use cortisone. So that is one of Dr. Percy Julian's contributions, is developing a method to create synthetic cortisone that can be produced in bulk and sold for cheap because it's produced in bulk. And it's used around the world for anti-inflammatory treatment in rheumatoid arthritis. The second example that I wanted to share was actually, I think, one of the earlier developments from Dr. Julian and his team when creating synthetic steroids from soybean plants. And that is the development of synthetic progesterone. So progesterone, you may have heard this, it is a sex hormone, one of the female sex hormones that's more predominant in females. And part of Dr. Julian's work at the Glidden Company was creating this industrial process to create progesterone from a chemical called stigmasterol, which is a steroid substance that was derived from the soybeans. So with these methods, Dr. Julian and his team were able to produce 5 to 6 pounds of progesterone a day. So again, being able to, which for the record, your body doesn't need 5 to 6 pounds of progesterone. That's a lot of progesterone. So these methods that Dr. Julian and his team at the Glidden Company spearheaded allowed, again, for the creation of this hormone in bulk. And that, in turn, allows for widespread use of progesterone, especially in therapeutic and clinical cases. So you might be wondering what progesterone is, how can it be used clinically, what's the point of it? There are actually a couple of different uses for synthetic progesterone. One is hormonal birth control. Another is therapeutically, it can be used to support pregnancy. And that seems kind of counterintuitive. Like when I first read that, I was like, that doesn't make sense, because how does the same drug support a pregnancy while also preventing a pregnancy? But we're going to get into it. So progesterone is a hormone that kind of ebbs and flows within the menstrual cycle. And maybe I could do an episode on the menstrual cycle to kind of talk about this in more detail. But the point is that there are certain times during a menstrual cycle where progesterone is low, and then there are certain points where the progesterone is high. And when the progesterone is high, it is creating an environment in the uterus that is conducive to pregnancy. So in the uterus, there's a lining called the endometrium, that this lining is kind of serving as a cushion for a fertilized egg to implant itself in. And then that fertilized egg kind of finds a spot in the wall of the uterus, and it kind of snuggles in there, and then a baby grows in there. And I'm not going to tell you anything before that. Go ask your parents. That's not my business to tell you what happens before that. But the point is that the progesterone is creating this cushiony endometrium, this plump, pillow-like endometrium for the fertilized egg to kind of snuggle up into. Okay. And it creates an environment naturally in the cyclical pattern of the menstrual cycle to allow this to happen, which is how and why some people take progesterone therapeutically to support pregnancy. So at the time that this was created, Dr. Julian and his team acknowledged its utility of synthetic progesterone to prevent miscarriages. So it's kind of can be applied and given to a person who is pregnant and wants to make sure that their little fertilized egg is chilling up nice and comfy in the uterus there. But also at low and constant doses, progesterone can be used as birth control, or what's the technical term for birth control? Contraceptive. There we go. Big word, multiple syllables, but I got it. So progesterone, when kept at this sort of like low constant concentration throughout the menstrual cycle, has contraceptive effects where it'll cause certain changes to the environment, the cervical environment, for example, where like the cervical mucus, sorry, I hate the word mucus, but this is science and this is what I have to say. It thickens when progesterone is kind of at this like steady state level. So for hormonal birth controls, including both the combination and mini pills, as well as the implant, as well as the hormonal IUDs or intrauterine devices, they all allow for this like constant release of progesterone that make changes to the environment that make a pregnancy less likely to happen or not as conducive to pregnancy, which I thought was really interesting. Like, who would have thought that would be the case, that it could both promote a pregnancy and also prevent a pregnancy? But science, man, that'll do it to you. But yeah, I thought that was pretty interesting. And I think that the main takeaway from this is that the methodologies that Dr. Julian developed can and still are used to help people in various conditions. Two given here are rheumatoid arthritis and contraception/pregnancy support. So I just thought that was really interesting, and his impact is still present today for many people, myself included. So we want to thank Dr. Julian for his contributions and his work, especially through all of the adversity that he faced, to be able to have the brilliant mind that created a method to make birth control from a soybean. Sure, why not? Why not? Thank you, Dr. Julian. Okay. And with that, we have reached the takeaways of this episode. First takeaway, of course, being a continued Happy Black History Month. Today, we talked about Dr. Mamie Phipps Clark and Dr. Kenneth Clark, who were psychologists that study the impact of racism in society on children's self-consciousness and vision of themselves and others. And their doll study was one of the points that was cited in the Supreme Court's Brown versus Board of Education decision, which I already kind of went on a spiel about, but I think it's very important. And I love to see when science informs legislation. So, snaps. We also talked about Dr. Percy Julian, who was an organic chemist who developed methods to synthesize steroid hormones including cortisone and progesterone from soybeans. And these synthetic hormones are used clinically to this day to help patients of numerous different backgrounds. So thank you to both Mamie Phipps Clark and Kenneth Clark, and thank you to Dr. Percy Julian for your contributions to your fields and the impact that you've made, not only on the people who, shared the space with you, fellow scientists, but also on the rest of us, because they have all contributed in their own way to making my life better. And I'm sure I can speak for many others in the US. They feel the same as well. And again, last point, diversity is important. Certainly not the least point, but it is the last point here. And it was the last point on the previous episode as well. But really just wanting to emphasize that science is for everyone. And everyone from different walks of life, different backgrounds, bring their own perspectives to problem solving, bring their own perspectives to investigation and to science in general. And that is valid, and that is really valued in what we need to do as a collective scientific community. So I'm very happy to have had this opportunity to celebrate Black scientists and their contributions to science, to really show that, we need diversity in science, and that regardless of where you've come from, regardless of what you look like, you are capable of contributing great things to this world, wherever you choose to do it. But I hope science is where you choose to do it, because I'm a little biased there. But yeah, diversity is important, and I want to take every opportunity to acknowledge the beauty and the importance of diversity in our society. All right, that is all for this episode. Please don't forget to follow, rate, and review the podcast wherever you're listening, and you can subscribe on YouTube, please. You can also follow the show on social media at samsplainingsci, so please connect with me there, and you can ask questions if you'd like. You can also ask questions at samsplainingscience.com/ask. So if you have any topic that you're curious about, that you want Sam explained to you, ask away. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode. I hope you learned a little bit, and I hope that you laughed a little bit, and I will talk to you next time. Bye.